thank you so much for being here with us today. We want to start off by just asking what drew you to this subject?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I kind of came into it in a backwards way. The book I did before this, and I should back up by saying I'm a mainstream science writer, so this is a really unusual book for a person like me. And the book I did before Ghost Hunters was a history of psychology book. It was about a very controversial University of Wisconsin psychologist, Harry Harlow, and the idea that love matters, which was not true in psychology in the late 19th and early 20th century, in which he crusaded for. So while I was working on that book, I was doing a lot of diving into the history of psychology and a kind of what is wrong with psychology and why would they argue that love was a meaningless thing. And in the course of doing that, as I got into the weeds of history of psychology, I kept seeing these references to William James having lost his mind. William James is a pillar of psychology, but he's also going completely crazy. And I remember this because I thought at the time, well, I thought William James was a really boring institution in the history of psychology. And so I was kind of kicking around this, and all of these references to his craziness had to do with his work in psychical research. And while I was still kind of mulling this over, I was in a used bookstore in Madison, Wisconsin, where I used to work, and found a book called William James on Psychical Research. And I bought it because I had been so sort of, what is going on here? Took it home, read it, and thought, this is an incredible story, right? This is just an incredible story of a leading figure in American psychology risking everything on this very, uh, to some people, improbable and non scientific quest. And also, there's a story in that book about a woman who dreams the disappearance of a young mill worker in the New England, which is such an amazing story. And so both of those things, I thought I really want to tell this story. And I really want to look at how we explain the inexplicable, right? And can the inexplicable be explained? And so I went to my agent and said, I know this is a weird book for me, but I want to look in this moment in time, right? And that was what really got me started.
And we're really glad you did because the book Ghost Hunters, it's quite a great book. I've been talking to some of my friends and quite a few of them have read it and they're like, "You get to interview the author?"
Oh, that's
So,
cool.
yeah. So, you've obviously made an impact. And just for our audience, the book's about a rigorous academic investigation of the paranormal that really took off around the latter part of the 1800s, early part of the 1900s. So, to kind of bring us back to that time, how was the paranormal seen by society at that time? Were they more open, more dismissive, skeptical, somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, that's a good, interesting point. So, this is a period of sort of social cultural upheaval in a lot of ways, in that, and I'm really talking about in the kind of push and pull between science and organized or institutional religion. Right. You had Darwin's On the Origin of Species that came out in the 1860s, and a whole raft of scientists that followed publication of that book arguing that science, not, classical religion, really explained the world around us. And in addition to Darwin's sort of dissection of biology and trying to explain how life formed on this planet and how human beings developed and how intelligence developed and all of the things that he addresses in that and his subsequent books, you had geologists who were busy peeling away the layers of the earth and finding these inexplicable fossils that dated back insanely long period of times and upsetting everything that was sort of laid out as the creation of earth, um, in a complete contradiction to the way religion, and not just Christian religion, but really all religions of the time, had tried to explain the origin of man and the origin of the earth. Right, there is a great quote, and I think I referenced it in ghost hunters from John Ruskin, who was a cultural critic at the time, saying that he would have been just fine except for the clang of the geologist's hammers upsetting everything. So you're at this period where science and religion are starting to really go into direct conflict on how we explain the world around us. And at the same time, this is a period where, we have a long history of religious belief. People believe in God or gods, depending on, what religion you practice. And they believe as part of that, in the fact that there is life after death, a heaven, an afterlife, a summerlands, a shadowland, all of the different ways that we think about that. And so you get a group of scientists, and I think Darwin was part of this, who are very religious, who start saying, well, okay, can we use science to actually answer some of these questions? Is there life after death, right? Wouldn't it make sense that this new powerful way of explaining the world around us could also explain and investigate this? Darwin falls out of that pretty quickly, but Alfred Russel Wallace, who came up with the theory of evolution about the same time, gets really involved with it. And the other thing that happens is because everyone is so unsettled by this, how do we define the world and life on Earth and life after Earth, as it were, that you see this moment where really high-end scientists, it's acceptable for them to actually go in and explore these questions. That's going to change, and it's going to change in William James's lifetime. But early on, there was a real acceptance that this was something that science should take on. So you get William James, you get Marie Curie, you get J.J. Thomson, who discovered the electron, you get, John Strout, Lord Rayleigh scattering, why is the sky blue, right? You get Charles Richet, who won the Nobel from anaphylactics, and so forth and so on. You get all of these very high-end scientists in a way you would never see today. And so the other thing I started realizing when I worked on this book is as I'm following their scientific investigations of phenomena, what's real, what's not real, what's supernatural, what's natural. This is the best ghost hunt in the history of science. There's never been a better one, right? And so for me, it was, if this is the best ghost hunt in the history of science, then what did it find?
Well, you started to touch on it already, but who are the main people that you focused on who were daring or crazy enough, as they were perceived, to investigate the paranormal? And what were their credentials to do so?
Sure. So I really focused on two groups, one in the US, they're sort of allied groups in the US and in the UK. And they formed organizations in Britain, the Society for Psychical Research, and in the United States, the American Society for Psychical Research. Now we say paranormal research or supernatural research, but then it was psychical. And in England, that included, a really famous utilitarian philosopher, Henry Sidgwick, his wife, Eleanor, who was very brilliant, methodical, meticulous researcher, Oliver Lodge, who was one of the early developments of radio communications. They were sort of the core of the group I was looking at over in the UK. There were others, right? But that over in the UK, that was probably the core of the group I really focused on. And there were a few other people who I thought were important. Frederick Myers, for instance, right, who wrote Phantasms of the Living. And then over in the US, James is really good friends. So William James is at Harvard at the time. He's a philosopher and a psychologist. At the time, he was more, in the late 19th century, he was more focused on psychology. He wrote The Principles of Psychology, one of the first psychology textbooks in the United States in really about the 1890s. Later, he would move more into philosophy. But because he was already interested in philosophy. He knew and was friends with the Sidgwicks, and his brother, the writer Henry James, was also friends with this group, right? So he was connected to them. And James helped launch the American Society for Psychical Research. And he was really the leading researcher over in the US. There were others, Richard Hodgson, for instance, who was an anthropologist who became one of the sort of administrators and researchers for that group. But when I think of the SPR, I think of William James. And a lot of people do. And that was one of the reasons why he became such a lightning rod. I mean, early on, there were other leading psychologists, Stanley Hall, Joseph Jastrow from the University of Wisconsin. People don't remember these names. When you are writing about history of science, one of the things you realize pretty quickly is that scientists who were famous in their own day are largely forgotten. We only remember a few of them, right? We remember Marie Curie, remember Albert Einstein, right? But if you actually go back and you say, who were the famous psychologists of the 19th century, even though I'm positive they were really impressed with themselves at the time, right? They're largely forgotten. But early on, this was a much larger group. And as it went forward and as it became obvious that this was going to be a daunting task, you start to see more mainstream scientists leaving, and William James really being the public face of the American group.
So those are some high-profile people doing ghost hunts.
Yes.
And did they come up with anything? What are some of the best evidences that they were able to come up with?
You know, let me say this first because I'm a science writer, and then I'll tell you what I think is particularly intriguing in some of their work. The way that we have built the structure of research, it requires a system which is largely based on hypothesis, research, and replication. So you make a hypothesis, you test that hypothesis with an experiment, and then one experiment is never enough. You're going to replicate, right? You're going to verify, you're going to do it again, you're going to prove that it's right. That's a system that completely does not work for supernatural or psychical research, right? Because a lot of the things that you're trying to study don't repeat. And so, as an example, one of the most common I'll say paranormal experiences, although I want to get at that definition if we have time. Is what they called crisis apparitions, and what people today sometimes call death visitants, and that's at the moment of someone's death, someone you were close to, someone you were connected to, you see them, you hear them, you feel a touch, you unexpectedly see their face in a crowd. You just have this sense of an encounter with a person, even though you didn't know they had died, right? I mean, that's a classic crisis apparition. I used to run around and tell the story about my father-in-law. My father-in-law was a Norwegian American small businessman in California, super grounded guy, who woke up in the middle of the night thinking he had heard his cousin out in the yard, woke up his wife, eventually goes out in their little California house to look for his cousin, and he's not there. Finally goes back to sleep trying to decide if he, just ate too much chili or whatever. And the next day, his cousin's son calls him, and at about the time that he is out in the yard looking for his cousin had committed suicide. He had shot himself to death. That's a very classic crisis apparition. That's the most common supernatural event. My guys, that's how I think of James and Company, tracked about or accumulated data on about 17,000 of these on every continent. And if you talk to people who do this kind of work today, like the group at the University of Virginia that studies supernatural phenomena, they'll tell you the same thing. This is the most common event, right? Completely not replicable, right? How would I prove that my father-in-law had an encounter with his dying cousin, right? It's not going to happen again. We can't it's not Groundhog Day. He's not going to die multiple times, right? So there's no way to verify that. So this is kind of the buzzsaw that my guys run into. So I think of them on looking at these events. They happen very frequently. When I went out and book toured, and I would say to people, "Hey, anyone ever have this kind of encounter?" Hands would go up all over the room. Right? It's astonishingly common. I even had hands go up all over the room when I gave a talk at a National Academy of Sciences event. Right? But what is it? Do we understand it? Is there any scientific evidence of what's going on there? Have we ever measured brain waves or, telepathic communication that would explain this? We have not, right? It's such a transient thing that there's actually no way for us as scientific researchers to validate that was anything at all except a coincidence. And so these guys, I think I mentioned that Frederick Myers wrote Phantasms of the Living, which is this book about the crisis apparition. They can come up with thousands and thousands and thousands of cases, but they can't prove that it's anything more than human superstition or susceptibility, right? So they raise the issue, they're not able to prove it. The one of the ways they tried to get at it, and this was also true with mediums, was they really looked at the issue of telepathy and the possibility that in life we communicate mind to mind, and there might be ways in which we communicate mind to mind, either at the moment of death or beyond. And so one of the ways that they explained that I actually kind of liked was that the idea that most of us are completely buffered from the thoughts of others, or mostly buffered from the thoughts of others, right? And that's a really good thing, right? If we walked around all day like human radio receivers, listening to the thoughts of everyone as we walk down a street or through a grocery store, you go nuts, right? So there's a sort of natural shielding to telepathic communication, according to this theory that James and his colleagues came up with. At the time of death, at a time of extreme intense emotional energy, the thoughts being sent out are so powerful they blast through your defenses and you receive some kind of communication. And people who become valid professional mediums, that was kind of their theory of them too, right? What they didn't know, and especially with the very few mediums that they were not able to entirely debunk, like Leonora Piper of Boston, who was William James' favorite medium. What they didn't know is if telepathy exists, and they believed it did, they just couldn't, again, figure out how to exactly validate it. And we've certainly, I should add, in modern times, never measured brain waves wafting from my brain to yours right at the moment, right? So, but if that happened, and you have a really talented medium who is telling you things that you think she shouldn't know, is she just reading your mind? Or is she actually communicating with someone on the other side, right? And if it's one or the other, how do you prove that? So a lot of what they ended up doing, I think, is raise really interesting questions and come up with thoughtful explanations for phenomena that are mysterious to this day in some ways, right? I wouldn't say they proved anything. And I think, you heard William James at the end of his life acknowledge that he had started out thinking, we're going to nail this. And he ended up going, this is sometime way after my death, someone may eventually figure this out because this is really hard stuff.
Well, you got into some of the things they did with like mediums and these other things. How are they testing for hoaxes and frauds? What methods are they using? Do you have are there stories of ways in which they tested these individuals?
Yes, and to be fair, there was a lot of mediumistic fraud, right? And you could actually go out and find, especially when people wanted kind of physical phenomena related to mediums, right? So they wanted ectoplasm, which, as far as I can tell, is mostly just egg whites piped out in some way. Or they wanted things to float in the air, or they wanted specters to rise. There were, like, one of the things you could find in the medium catalogs was a device you could put in the heel, the hollow heel of a shoe, that if the medium pushed a little spring-loaded thing, a ghost would rise up behind her, right? I mean, so a lot of what they did is debunk fraud. They were widely hated across the spectrum of practicing, for hire mediums, because there was a lot of fraud out there. So when you get to someone who seems to be valid, and I'm just going to use William James's favorite medium, Leonora Piper, as an example, and talk a little bit about how they studied her. She was a trance medium, right? She would go into a trance and then communicate information. I'm air quoting this, from the other side, right? Allegedly. And so when they were studying her, they would completely isolate her. Richard Hodgson had spies following her to see if she was secretly meeting with people to get information. They would read all her mail. I remember there was one case where someone came to have a sitting with Leonora Piper at her house and tried to come in. It was a pouring rain, and he came in with an umbrella, and Richard Hodgson wouldn't let that person bring the umbrella into the house because you could conceal information in the folds of an umbrella, right? And at one point, they actually took her and moved her to England, right? Disconnected her from everyone she knew, moved her. She stayed at Oliver Lodge's house. He fired all his servants, which I've always thought was completely unfair, and hired new servants so that no one in the house knew anything about him. And again, they spied on her and read her mail and really isolated her. And so in that kind of vacuum that they put her in, they also tested the validity of her trances. They would burn her. They would drop acid on her arms. They would hold matches to her skin. I mean, it's like torture, right? To see if she was really in a trance or faking a trance. And she consistently passed the torture test, right? Either she was really good and had a very high level of pain tolerance, way beyond mine, or she really was in a trance. I mean, they concluded she was really in a trance. I'm trying to, sort of walk the balance of, but what if? In those circumstances, there were times that she would reveal information that even and I'm a fairly skeptical science writer. I am a skeptical science writer. When I took on this book, I thought I was the perfect person to write the book because I didn't believe in any of it, and I had never had a paranormal experience, right? No crisis apparitions in my life history. But one of my favorite things, some of them in England are pretty inexplicable, but one of my favorite ones from Boston. Another professor at Harvard wrote to James about this, and he had gone to visit her in this period where they were watching her every move. And he had gone under an assumed name, right? So she didn't know who he was. And he, in few years earlier, he and his mother had exchanged rings and engraved. It's very Victorian, right? The man and his mother, but they had exchanged rings with little special messages inside them. And he had lost the ring his mother gave him, but when she had died, he had gotten the ring he had given her that had the special message. So he came into the room. He didn't have the ring with him. And he said, tell him, here's this story. Ask my mother what was in the ring, right? And that she gave me. And she told him not that, but the exact inscription that was in the ring he had lost, right? And so you go, well, how'd she know that? Right? It's not like he had a chance to leak the information to her. It's not like she knew who he was. So how would she know what was in the lost ring? And so there were a few things for me, not everything she did, right? But especially in this early period where she was blowing William James away, right? I would find myself going, how would you explain that? Right? How do you explain that away? And sort of the theories I discussed, the telepathy theory, right? For instance, could easily have been, if we believe in telepathy, that would be a simple explanation, right? That she picked that up from him, not necessarily that she was interrogating his dead mother, right? But that she was able to, so one or the other. But their premise was that if you can have mind to mind communication, um, then you could have mind to mind on the other side of the afterlife communication. And much later, they did this very complicated experiment with mediums in 3 different countries and members of the society who had died, and with one medium in one country trying to send information about some ghostly thing to another country. And again, a little bit of it is kind of like, how in the world did that happen? So I found, not that I think that you got to the end of this and said, wow, they have totally nailed this. But as a science writer, it changed the way I thought about this terrain in some really interesting ways that continue to this day. Right.
So, if I could touch on that Leonora Piper example, that's
Yeah.
some fascinating stuff right there. And unlike the crisis apparition, it does seem like this is much more of a controlled, even possibly repeatable scientific experiment.
hmm
Would you give more weight to that? And did they give more weight to that?
You know, that's a really interesting question. I don't know that I would argue that they would have given that more weight, because they were interested in like the whole human spectrum of these experiences. And so the crisis apparition was, do all of us have some of these abilities, right? Are there moments? And so they thought that that really illustrated this, that this was part of human ability across the board, right? That a medium like Leonora Piper would be an exceptional example of those abilities, but that she wasn't like an alien species, right? Um, but they looked at a lot of mediums, and some of the studies they did with some of the physical mediums, like Eustapia Palladino, who they took to an island in the Mediterranean to isolate, right, are pretty fascinating stuff. I find her completely unbelievable, but like I said, I don't warm up to all the physical stuff. But Leonora Piper, I think that so here's where I think she worked for them, and they were never able to debunk her. As she got older, things got messier. And in the book I wrote about something that they talked about in mediums, which was something called the decline effect, right? That you might have a period where you were particularly acute in picking up messages, but you didn't necessarily keep it. And they felt like they saw that in Leonora Piper, right? That later in her career, what they were getting was not as good, and that she was trying to cover it up a little bit, right? And so I think that kind of muddied the picture with her. But at the height of her powers, when James and Hodgson were studying her in Boston, and they really had her hermetically sealed in the 19th century version of saran wrap almost, right? And she was still producing these really inexplicable results. Um, and when she went to England and was able to do some readings there where the people in England were baffled, you're going, okay, here is like a case study in someone who does this over and over and over again, right? So they saw her as adding real credibility to the fact that some people had this unique talent and could really pick up on whatever the transmissions were that were coming. There's a famous quote from William James about Leonora Piper in which he said, if you want to prove that all crows are not black, you need only find one white crow. You only need one. And Leonora Piper is my white crow. And so he didn't go that much beyond her, but to him, some of this early work that she did, and she wasn't actually taking money when she started doing it, she was doing it as a favor for friends, right? Made him say, there's something here, right? And I think you can look at their work and find all these moments where, and I certainly did, where I'm like, okay, I can't entirely explain that away. Of course, I wasn't there. I'm reading this documentation, you know, over 100 years later, trying to figure out what's real and what's not. So take me with a grain of salt. But there were moments in the where you're like, I can't explain that away. Or William James on psychical research, to go back to that just briefly. So the story that I found really intriguing is the story where a young mill worker, a young female mill worker goes for a walk one morning and she disappears. And people see her walking down toward this lake. It's in New Hampshire. But then she just vanishes. And they end up, you know, they're searching the woods, they're searching the village, nothing. They finally hire a diver, have a diver sent from Boston to search the lake, nothing. Meanwhile, there's a woman in another village who has her family has a kind of psychical history. Her grandmother was a medium. And she has this dream in which she sees the girl, and it's not the first time she's had this kind of dream, walking on the bridge across the lake and slipping off the edge. It's a wooden bridge. It's a frosty morning. She slips, and she sees her caught in the supports of the lake, so of the bridge. So the diver's not finding her, if this dream is right, because she's not out in the lake. She's stuck in the supports of the bridge. So she gets her husband to drive her to town, and she talks to the mill owner, and the diver from Boston says, I'm not going to go looking where some crazy lady tells me to look. Come on, I'm a professional. And the mill owner says to him, yeah, I know, and I know it's nonsense, but a lot of people in this area believe in these things, and so let's give her one chance. And the story I'm telling you was documented by William James, and the article in this particular book that I had, you know, is built on the interviews that he did with the diver and the mill owner and people in the village, and you know, it's sort of like a journalistic investigation. And so the diver agrees to let her have one shot, and she walks out on the bridge and stops, and then walks about 2 pilings further and says she's here. And the diver goes down there. And a minute later or so, the girl's bonnet starts floating up out of the water and is on the water. And then he pulls the body out. And as part of the investigation, James and his group had, you know, done all of this work. Did the woman know the girl? Could she have been stalking her? Could she have killed her? Right? Is this all an entire setup? Nothing, no contact. She lives miles away. They've never had anything to do with each other. And there's this great moment in those interviews where someone says to the diver, you know, you go into these very dark bodies of water all the time looking for bodies. Isn't that just weird and scary? And he says, no, I wasn't scared at all going into the lake looking for the body. He said, I was afraid of the woman on the bridge. And that was really a moment for me. I'm like, wow, right? And I also, when you read it and you see how meticulous that investigation is, and this was really characteristic of their work, not just with Leonora Piper, but with these phenomena they investigated, I'm like, well, how do you explain that, right? Or how do you explain that away? And so I tried in my book to allow for room to say, you know, we have these inexplicable things, right? Do we just dismiss them as superstition or coincidence? Or, this woman had this lucky dream, right, out of nowhere about this death, and stood in the right place on the bridge, and well, life is really weird that way, right? Or do you say, there's something here we don't understand? And I ended up, and this is where I am today, saying, I don't think we're talking about the supernatural. I think we're talking about the natural we don't yet understand. And I think it's hubris to think we understand everything from our vantage point on a tiny planet in one of the many multiverses around us, right? So I ended up thinking, okay, I can't explain all of this away. From people who are, qualified skeptics, I took some heat for that. That I was willing to say, no, this is all just ridiculous. I wasn't willing to go there, right? I was more willing to say, we don't fully understand this. And not everyone loves that position in a science writer like me, right?
We do.
Thank you. But I felt like in the end it made me a better science writer, right? I think it's hubris to say we understand everything. And so I kind of like where I am in this more leave the door open to possibility place that the book took me to.
Thanks again for listening to the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. If you like what you heard, please consider subscribing and leaving us a 5-star review. We're an up-and-coming podcast, and every little bit helps. Also consider joining our Patreon page. Patreon sponsors have exclusive access to unaired episodes, different kinds of merchandise, the ability to suggest an episode, and even an hour-long interview with Jonathan and I. Check it out at spirituallyincorrectpodcast.com and see what you're missing out on. Sound effects from Zapsplat.com. Special thanks to Jordan Birch, whose song Starry Night provides the intro and outro for this podcast. You can hear more of his music on YouTube or Spotify.